30 seconds. I'm just checking everything's all right. All right, hello and welcome everyone to God channel. Today we have a really special guest. We have our very own Millete. And this is something that has been in the works for a long time. Millete hasn't it been, and I'm really delighted and excited that you have joined me today. I know that you have a very busy schedule, but I think you taken the time to sit with me today. So really appreciating of your generosity, Millete, and thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Tigray. I'm a big fan of Tigat and all the work you do, and how you've been able to record what's been happening in a way that makes sense and is comprehensive. And so thank you for inviting me on today.
It's my pleasure. Millete, our original plan was that we would talk about the thing that both of us have been doing for the past 2 years now, to do with journalism, activism, and also advocacy, and being engaged in our community generally. But I think we would be remiss if we didn't start with what happened over the last couple of days, and especially what happened today with the devastating bombing of kindergarten, from what we have been able to gather in Matale. What is your sense of what has happened today?
Today is a really tragic and sad day for Tigrayans. As you know, there was a bombing by the Ethiopian Air Force on a kindergarten / daycare. It's called Paradise Kindergarten, I believe, in Millete. And our understanding, it's still developing, but our understanding is that the youngest individual killed is a baby, a 3-year-old baby. And so far, I think 14 deaths have been recorded. We're still waiting on information. As you know, it's slow coming out, but it's devastating. Tigrayans have a government that is willing to over and over again kill civilians. And, you know, war is always horrible and there's always lots of death and destruction. But what's unique here is the Ethiopian government continues to target civilians. We know that at least 500,000 civilians have been killed. Civilians, these are not combatants. That's a whole different conversation. So this keeps happening over and over again. And for some reason, I don't know that the world has become desensitized to the pain of Tigrayans, but nothing is changing and it's not going to change. So it's a devastating and tragic day. But we've had a devastating 2 years. And I'm sorry, but a lot of us are losing hope in anyone coming to help us. It looks like it's going to be Tigrayans who get themselves out of this situation, which has been true in history in the past as well. So just an awful day for us.
Yeah. Why a kindergarten? I mean, and we both know that cruelty is the basic essence of the Abiy regime. So it's not something that's a sideshow or collateral thing that happens. But I think one of the main kind of tactics that they use is to terrorize the people by unleashing every kind of cruelty. But I just can't wrap my head around the idea of bombing the kindergarten. So why do you think, what is the thinking? What are they trying to get at by bombing kindergarten? Do you think there is any kind of thought behind that, or it was just a random target and it happened to be a kindergarten? What's happening? If you could make sense of it. I know it's very difficult.
Yeah, it's hard to analyze, but I will say that it's hard to say that it's random because they keep hitting similar targets over and over again. If you recall, they hit an IDP camp previously. They being the Ethiopian government, they hit hospitals. We're talking about just in the last year. And so the idea that they now accidentally, or they're missing their targets, because that theory has been thrown out as well, right? When the Ethiopian government got drones and they got people to come in and show them how to use drones, which is a dangerous form of warfare, because you can literally push a button, you're not even there, and you can cause major catastrophe, right? There was a lot of talk about, well, maybe the lack of training, the lack of, these killer birds are new to the government. And so maybe they don't know how to use them. And so, we bought into that story just a little bit. It doesn't make it any better, but it was one plausible story. However, why do they keep mistakenly hitting all of these targets where civilians are? I don't believe that's a mistake. I believe it's to terrorize the people of Tigray. And because they can't win on a ground game, this is the only way that the Ethiopian government can operate. And it's devastating, So I don't think it's an accident. I think it's intentional. I think it's meant to terrorize.
Well, interesting. You made distinction between conventional aircraft and drones, and I think from what I have been able to gather, I think the device that was used today was an aircraft. It wasn't a drone, so they can't even say that it was a case of someone who didn't know how to operate a drone, although they wouldn't, hesitate to use that kind of excuse. But there was something really, really bizarre in what happened today, which was that a couple of minutes actually after they bombed, I think they panicked and they issued a statement which was a warning to the Tigrayan people. It was written in English and posted on Twitter. Now, of course, there is the irony of the idea of writing something in English addressed to the Tigray people who have been cut off from every form of communication, and the warning coming after the bombing had already happened. But anyways, the basic essence of the warning is to tell the Tigray people to stay away from potential targets. But of course, the people don't know what the potential targets are, right? So so for instance, normally a kindergarten wouldn't be a potential target. So even if they had heeded that advice before the bombing, people wouldn't have stayed away from a kindergarten, because normally kindergarten is a safe place. But they had the brass neck to issue that statement in public. And one of the things that has really, really shocked me is not that they said that, because they would do that. They have been saying extremely crazy and deranged stuff for the past 2 years, but there hasn't been any sort of reaction by way of opprobrium or rejection on the part of the international community. And it's not an isolated incident, actually. The past couple of days, there has been a pattern where main actors, we could mention the WFP, I think it's the chief, David Beasley, and the administrator of the USAID, they have been kind of expressing some sort of support to the Abiy government, and also invariably condemning the TPLF, including the theft of the field. We'll come to that. So very dangerous and fishy thing happening. What do you think is happening there? I don't know if my point is clear.
It is very clear. Here's the thing. Why do we expect decency and morality from a regime that has gone into churches and massacred people in prayer? The Aksum massacre, where the number that's given is somewhere around 700, but it's more likely in the thousands of people who were killed in that massacre. They went into a church, Mariam Dingalet, they killed Sunday school children. And yet we continue to question why they do these very immoral things like bombing schools. We should expect no more from this type of a regime, from this type of a government. It's not even a government, it's a terrorist organization. We need to label it as such. The PP party, the Prosperity Party, has done nothing but bring death and destruction in ways that no one in the world should accept or can accept, even by virtue of a siege on the people of Tigray. It is illegal, completely illegal, to hold 7 million people hostage because you believe you need to catch a certain number of people who you have decided are terrorists. You can't even do to terrorists what they are doing to an entire nation of people. So I don't think that we should expect anything more from this government. It's time that the world responds and reacts to that as well. And if not, then as Tigrayans, we can't continue just to die silently. We can't. So that's those are just my thoughts on the government. And yes, it's a shame that they issue a statement on Twitter, of all places, as if the people of Tigray, even with access, are on Twitter. It just is such a joke. And then in English, and then, like you said, after the attack happened. I mean, you can't write a better joke. And it would be funny if people weren't dying. I mean, it's really insulting to think that these are people leading an entire nation. And it's all for show. They're not doing it to warn the people of Tigray. They won't even allow us to call and check and see what's going on. So those are just my thoughts on this regime and how they continue to terrorize Tigrayans. As far as the aid agencies and the so-called partners that are supposed to be helping us, it has been really eye-opening to see the reactions and to see how they responded to 12 missing, disappearing tankers, as opposed to like the 23 aid workers who've been killed by the government of Ethiopia. And the lack of outrage. I mean, there was a few messages, but it wasn't even this type of outrage that we're seeing about missing fuel tankers. So there's a huge hypocrisy in terms of how these organizations respond to terrorism being put on by the Ethiopian government. I mean, it shows us that they chose silence. The past 2 years, we've been screaming at the top of our lungs for a response from these groups whose job is to manage these kind of disasters. And they've been silent. And so the response over the past couple of days over fuel, which, by the way, was a whole big lie. One thing I've learned over the past 2 years is no matter what story you're given initially, ask more questions. Our problem is we have a lot of people who want to give opinions. Ask more questions, and including the journalists who are covering these stories, ask more questions, because the fact is none of the initial stories that were given are true. And once you dig deeper and ask a few more questions, suddenly, the truth emerges. So I don't know what to make of the World Food Program and David Beasley and his outrage about missing fuel tankers, because we've heard nothing about the bombing today, as you already said. So it really makes you feel like we're alone. Tigrayans are alone in saving themselves. We are inconsequential victims. We're in a part of the world and of a skin color that people just don't relate to. And I think there's also this belief of Africans, they're always at war, like let them finish each other kind of thing. And we buy into that. We too are not advocating in ways that I think are effective to bring change. So I don't know if we should be expecting more from these organizations or if we should just be brushing them aside. The problem is it's our only lifeline at the moment. So what do you do? What do you do with that?
Yeah.
It's an impossible situation.
Yes. Well, ask questions. I think that's a very, very useful maxim. And if anybody had bothered to ask, of course, they would have known that the story wasn't as sensational as David Beasley tried to make it out. It was actually very mundane. So to those, some of our listeners who might not be aware of what happened, so what happened was that, at least according to the Tigray government's telling, the Tigray government had lent some fuel to the WFP to run some of its operations, and the Tigray government had already written a letter requesting that the WFP return some of the fuel because they wanted it for other purposes, and the WFP didn't return in time. So what happened was that they went ahead, the Tigray government, and took what they thought was theirs. Now, you could debate whether that was the right way or the wrong way to go about things, right? But at the very least, it wasn't theft. That wasn't what happened. And he should have provided proper context. And the people who latched on to his story should have first asked the Tigray government for the comment for what happened. And they should have tried to provide both sides of the story. But of course, none of that happened. And everybody jumped on the bandwagon and condemned the Tigray government in the strongest possible terms, as though they had murdered, thousands of people. When in fact, what happened was they just took fuel. Even if it was theft, that's my point. Given the situation in Tigray, given the circumstances, right, they should have been excused, given that they are in extremely difficult situations. It doesn't warrant the kind of condemnation that Samantha Power and David Beasley and the other people in the UN issued. But I think my sense, and I don't have any evidence, but my sense was that if you just try to connect the dots, they were trying to provide Abiy an excuse to do what he did today. You know, that the TPLF was kind of hoarding fuels in some obscure location in Mekelle, that they had hoarded maybe grain and whatever, and so that for Abiy to come today and say, and I wouldn't be surprised if the Ethiopian government or regime, I should say, came tomorrow and said that they were trying to target the field that the TPLF had stolen. So I think my sense, I could be wrong, but my sense is that the David Beasleys and Samantha Powers and the other people were trying to give Abiy a justification for what he did today.
Absolutely. Here's the thing. Supposedly we've had a truce going on. I don't believe that we had a truce going on, because the suffering never actually stopped for the people of Tigray. Services were never restored to the people of Tigray. If there were a true truce, we wouldn't have to rely on aid trucks, you know, who don't have enough fuel, because banking would be back on, services would be restored. There would be all of these things in Tigray if we truly had a truce that was meant to bring peace. But supposedly we had a truce. Okay, let's just accept that as what people say. If we had a truce, then the government of Ethiopia, the Prosperity Party, broke the truce. They fired first, and then, if you recall, and they said it was just an officer or soldier or whatever who mistakenly shot, or whatever the story was that it's always changing. So if he indeed broke the truce, they needed a reason to, like you said, justify that. So they came up with all these things. They said that there was a plane, remember, the disappearing plane. They don't even know where it crashed. It either crashed in Mekelle, or it was crossing Sudan, or, I mean, there was 3 different locations given for where this so-called plane with cargo and ammunition
and apparently it was shot down in the middle of it unloading the weapons that it was supposedly relaying to Tigray.
Right. Yeah, so continue. Then that story didn't hold weight, right? 3 different government officials gave 3 different locations of where this happened. So it was clearly a big lie. So, you know, they had that. Then they had to go to the fuel tankers. So they were looking for an excuse to restart the war, which in my opinion had never stopped anyways. It was still ongoing. It just sort of maybe a de-escalation of the actual, you know, shooting and bombing and all of that. But the war itself on Tigray never ended. So I agree with you. I think that we're missing something here, in that we're pleading for help from people who support unconditionally the government of Ethiopia, unconditionally support Abiy Ahmed and the Prosperity Party. We should be asking why. There's no access. There are no journalists on the ground there. The international media, we're missing this point. Why? And I mean, I can theorize, but that's not helpful. You know what I mean? We need to know why the world refuses, and not only refuses to hold Abiy Ahmed accountable, but supports and helps him in all of the things that he's doing. They keep giving him loans. As soon as there's a campaign to try and prevent some funding, maybe it works. As soon as we turn around onto the next issue, funding is once again reviewed, and they're given the money from the World Bank or from whoever. So there is a strong intention and desire to keep Abiy Ahmed at the helm of a failing country. We're talking about Tigray, but the entire Ethiopia is failing right now. So I could see if the rest was prospering and it was just Tigray. But this is clearly someone who can't lead a nation. And here he is trying to lead this country of several nations. And he's failed miserably. And the world just says, well, it's okay. We'll give him another chance. So, you know, a few 100,000 Africans have died. Let's just give him one more chance. It's mind-boggling to understand why. And I mean, I can give you my theory. I think that Abiy Ahmed has done what no other leaders in modern Ethiopia have done, and that's open up and sell Ethiopia to the highest bidder. So while we needed to maybe decentralize state assets because we were at the other extreme, what he did was go swing to the other extreme. And so for capitalists and Westerners, this is perfect. This is wonderful. They have a chance now to own Ethiopia. I mean, it's like backdoor colonization, essentially. But he feeds in more, and I think he's more malleable and more, impressionable, and they can use him in ways that other leaders, whether you like them or not, were not as easily played. So it's not going to change. They want him there for a reason. So this is going to be something that's broken by force, not by diplomacy.
Yeah, well, I think we will come to talk about what it is that we should do now, given the things that have happened. But I think I will add something to what you said in terms of the reluctance on the part of the international community to pick up stories that the Tigray government has been saying for the past 2 weeks. I think a week ago, the Tigray government issued a statement saying that the Abiy forces in Western Tigray had shelled their positions. And they wrote a statement and they provided evidence detailing everything, how things transpired. And nobody picked up that story. And also when the kind of war officially restarted 2 days ago, the Tigray government provided an account of what exactly happened. And even then there was a reluctance on the part of the international community to pick up the story that the Tigray government, at the very least, to say that, all right, this is what the Tigray government is saying, and this is what the Abiy regime is saying, and what do we think, right? Normally, that's what you would expect to happen. And even today, we mentioned earlier regarding the bombing, there was actually an interesting tweet from the UN right before we started recording. The UN said that it would be concerned if there was bombing, but that it wasn't in a position to confirm whether or not bombing had happened in Mekelle. So they were able to confirm that fuel had been stored yesterday within minutes, but they are unable to confirm whether or not there was bombing, even though social media is now awash with blood of children, flooding in Mekelle. So for me, there is a clear attempt on the part of the international community to look the other way at the Abiy regime unleashes devastation in Tigray. So, but interestingly, you mentioned we don't know the whys, and you're right. But I think in the case of, for instance, this is something that I have been able to learn lately in terms of the David Beasley, for instance. And as much as I wouldn't want to go into innuendo or stuff like that, but I think this is public information. He is mates with Abiy, not just mate, but also prayer partner, and also apparently some sort of spiritual counsel. And this is something that is on record, so I'm not trying to smear people's kind of character. And also, if you check his Twitter for the past 2 years, there hasn't been an instance where he raised the blockade or the starvation in Tigray. Although he was the first one to condemn the TPLF for alleged theft. So clearly he's on Abiy's team. You could clearly see that. There is no hesitation. It's absolutely in your eyes. It's just clear. But people like Samantha Power and the other people, I wouldn't have expected them to be blatantly supportive of a regime that is clearly committing genocide. We could debate about the exact details, but there is agreement that at the very least ethnic cleansing and the other atrocities have happened. So for them to want to support him now, I can't understand what the thinking might be. So maybe if you could say a few words about that, Millete.
I think that's really interesting. I don't, obviously you did the research and went back and looked at how they've messaged over the past couple of years. I don't know, like someone like Samantha Powers, who has openly said it is the Ethiopian government who is blocking aid. It is the Ethiopian government who is restricting access. It is the Ethiopian government who killed aid workers. She said things like that. So I'm not so sure that, I think what happened is she took for granted the message that came from the World Food Program. And I think you would. Why wouldn't you? This is the director of a well-known organization. Why wouldn't you take that authority seriously when they make this kind of comment? What's sad is that individual abused their position by making that tweet, and still, I believe until now, has not retracted it or correct, you know what I mean, at least gave some clarification on what actually transpired. And I think that a lot of the world is being misled by people who are compromised. I don't think it's appropriate for David Beasley to be in a prayer circle with Abiy Ahmed and be a spiritual advisor to him and lead in this situation. I think it's completely inappropriate. And it's those kind of things that need to be called out. I'm a Christian. I pray. I believe in prayer circles. I believe in all of that. However, this relationship is wholly inappropriate. And so we have a responsibility to make sure these things are known. Here's the thing, Tigray. There are so many atrocities and so many abuses that you can't even fully process and analyze and bring to light one before the next thing is happening. And so I think that's been our disadvantage as well. I do want to give credit to the government of Tigray, though, because even under all of these conditions and circumstances, they have really grown in the last 2 years, in my opinion. I think the fact that they're holding receipts and bringing information forward so much quicker, I think is a huge help to all of us who are trying to tell these stories. So like you pointed out, when the whole fuel story came up and they said, wait a minute, here's our agreement, here's what actually happened. And, let's clarify this. Here's the evidence. Whereas you have someone with the World Food Program, a prestigious organization that I would say has done a lot of good in the world, who has an emotional outburst, not facts and evidence to back it up. So kudos to the government of Tigray for being able to do that, and I hope they continue to do that. Same thing when, when Lucy did her story about the cash smugglers, which was a really interesting way of how she told that story. I thought was really bizarre. She's a journalist. She's entitled to tell that story, as she should. But the way she told the story and the quick response from the government, giving more information, which is what she should have done to begin with, was seek out more information and then tell the story. It's fine to tell the story. Our problem is there's always stuff missing. And so when people like Lucy or David Beasley tell these stories without doing the right amount of research, it's resulting in more death and destruction for the people of Tigray. People don't recognize that their mistakes cost lives. This is very serious stuff. It's not something you can just brush under a rug. So I wanted to say those things. The other thing I want to say is one thing that Ethiopia has done successfully, Ethiopia as a nation, a country, whatever, the leadership, the political parties, they've made a boogeyman out of TPLF. TPLF, a political party of over 2 million people. They've made a boogeyman out of them. So if you ever want to confuse somebody or someone who wants to get involved or understand what's happening in Ethiopia, in Tigray, in the Horn of Africa, you say TPLF and their eyes get big and they're you know what I mean? They have some impression of what that means. And so I think we've done a poor job of telling our story. That doesn't mean, by the way, I'm not saying anyone is above reproach. You have to always be willing to confront your government. You have to always be willing to ask more questions and demand more of an entity that works for you. However, they have successfully told a narrative that dehumanizes a political party of several million people. And so whenever something goes wrong and someone says, well, it's TPLF, it's almost accepted and easy for people in the world to latch onto that and carry that story forward. When you try and tell similar stories about the truth of what's happening, and you talk about the Prosperity Party, which is really a terrorist organization. This is a terrorist organization holding people hostage, refusing them food, allowing foreign countries to come in and occupy and kill and rape and pillage and loot their people. That's the work of a terrorist, not of a government organization. So another one of our really big issues is how we tell our stories and how we define things. And so, Tigrayans are a minority population. So we're fighting a huge machine. And we have a big disadvantage, but we just have to, and I think we're doing a better job of that. So just continuing to tell our stories and clear up those narratives. But I think that's why it's easy for Samantha Powers or whoever else to retweet and grab onto those conversations.
Yes. We'll come to the, you said that the Tigray government deserves credit, and you said other interesting things. So we'll come back to that. But I think to close the circle on why some actors in the international community are supporting Abiy, there was an interesting point made on Twitter by Lionel Lefort. I don't know if you follow him. But he said that it's kind of a theory that he put forward, maybe a hypothesis more than a theory. He said that maybe the reason they have decided to shift support to Abiy is because they see the Tigray government as the adult in the room. Because Abiy has kind of resorted to medieval war tactics of starvation and barbarism and all that, and they have accepted that, and they have come to realize that the more they reprimand Abiy, the worse he gets in his barbaric tactics. So they might have concluded that it could actually be a good idea to reprimand the TPLF rather, the Tigray government rather, because they are more likely to heed to their advice and to listen to their kind of condemnation. So that could be a very, very sick thinking, I know, but that could be the rationale. Do you see maybe that could be a possibility, Millete?
Wow.
And if that is the case, we would have been shooting ourselves in the foot, really, because that's what we would mean.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's an interesting theory. Do you coddle the baby, or do you reprimand the child and figure out how to bring them, to a different place? So I don't think coddling is the right answer. And so if it is, it's a tragic thing, because it's going to produce the same outcome. How are you going to get a different outcome if you continue to basically support what someone is doing? So I don't follow him, and I didn't see that. I think it's a really tragic way of looking at it. I also think that this whole war, genocide could be stopped in an instant if the West would be more stern in terms of what's right and wrong. The world knows this is wrong. The world knows starvation is wrong. Man-made starvation is wrong. Everyone knows that weaponized rape is wrong. We all know this is wrong. Bombing a kindergarten is wrong. There's no question about any of this. But Tigray, and I'm not the expert on this, but we do know that there is a proxy war happening now. This wasn't very clear to me early on when all of this first started, but it's very clear now. And the West is playing this really dangerous game of cat and mouse because it doesn't want to lose its influence in the Horn to places like Russia or China or the Gulf states. So it's very clear to me now that there's so much more going on, and we are not centered. The people of Tigray are not centered in this conversation. Frankly, the people of Ethiopia are not centered in this conversation. If we are still part of that wretched country, no, that is not who's being centered here. The game that they're playing is about who will have more influence, who will have more control. That's why you're not getting the type of response that would be logical from countries that supposedly fight for human rights. And we could go down a whole rabbit hole with all of that. But in general, I think that's probably more of a reality than just trying to appease a baby, because they could take him out in a minute. They did it with Gaddafi. Let's be honest, so it's not hard. They could take Isaias out any minute, but Isaias helped the West. He was a spy. Everyone knows that story. So these wretched, awful leaders get second and third and fourth and fifth lives because they are helpful to nations that could take them out. So I think there's a whole lot more to this that we are missing, and no one cares if 500,000 Tigrayans die besides Tigrayans. Yeah. It's just the reality.
Yeah. Well, I think your point with respect to proxy war, Millete, deserves some sort of exploration, because I think one of the difficulties that, and I'm guessing without any kind of knowledge, but one of the difficulties that the envoys and the Western diplomats and the other people who have been trying to kind of bring the two parties together, as they say, one of the problems they might be facing is they don't actually know who is pulling the actual strings in Addis, right? So you could make Abiy kind of accede to a certain proposal, right? But you don't know whether you could actually execute that proposal, because Isaias might reject it. And what do? And Abiy is not open with what he is capable of doing and what he's not capable of doing, because he's, let's face it, he's a puppet to Isaias, right? So there's that problem of not knowing who is really in charge. like how much of a stake do the Arab bosses have in Ethiopia? How much of a stake and control and sway does Isaias and his security operatives have in Ethiopia? And what is Abiy actually, what is his leverage? What is he capable of doing? And how much of power do the Amhara extremists, wield over Abiy? So these are very, very difficult questions. I think that might be complicating the effort to bring the two parties together and to kind of make them agree, at least on some very basic kind of propositions. But I think that would take us to another topic. Maybe that's for another time. But I want to return to the point you raised about the Tigray government deserving some credit, Millete. And I see where you're coming from, and broadly, I would agree with that. But to just play some sort of devil's advocate, I think some people would say that, number one, the Tigray government has been very naive, especially in trusting the international community, especially if they claim that, for instance, they returned from Deir Burhan because they trusted the US would do the right thing. That would be extraordinarily naive, right? And some people do really believe that that is what happened. So that is one thing, I think, where the Tigray government has really compromised itself. That's one thing. The other thing is they are generally holding back the TDF now. Some people would allege that if the Tigray government would give the TDF the green light, maybe not overnight, but in a couple of weeks or months, the TDF might be in a position to liberate at the very least Tigray. And the reason that's not happening is because the TPLF is not really giving political leadership. So those would be some of the kind of reservations that some people might raise. What are your thoughts on either both or one of them?
I mean, I think it's fair. I think it's fair to criticize. I think it's fair to raise those points. I would not call the government of Tigray naive because, yeah, you do have to go, if you go into a negotiation, you do have to go into it sincerely, hoping that a change is going to come. I do agree that we've waited too long and don't see the change that's been promised. And so then what do you do? I also think that it's easy for us to say, go fight, go back, go back to war. You and I are not the ones on the front line. You and I are not the ones who call the shots for these people to go out and sacrifice their lives, because regardless of the final outcome, which no doubt that Tigray will succeed, it's still a lot of death and destruction that comes with that. The other side of that is death and destruction is happening anyways. It's not stopping as a result. So I agree with you. I think it's fair to challenge the government in terms of their sort of like tepidness to go back, and demand, you know what I mean? I think there's been a lot of asking for things to happen rather than demanding, and that's frustrating. It's frustrating for a lot of us. But these are people who operated on an international stage. These are not people like Abiy Ahmed, who really, he's not even comfortable speaking on a world stage or among nationalist Ethiopians. He's not even comfortable. You can see it. And so, when we're talking about the government of Tigray, we're talking about statesmen. And so I have to say that there has to be some level of thought that's going into everything. I wish that we knew a little bit more. And I wish that we would stop sacrificing so many, because every day of inaction is deaths in the hundreds, if not more, from painful deaths from starvation and lack of medicine. Even personally, I can tell you, I mean, I haven't talked to anybody. However, in the first 6 months, when the power came on for an instant and the phones came on for an instant, when they took Millete, I learned of 9 deaths, 9, either from all civilian. I'm not talking about combatants. I'm talking about civilian deaths of elderly people. My grandmother's sister who was slaughtered by Eritrean forces. Imagine that. I have a cousin whose head, he was decapitated by Eritrean soldiers. This is like, so when you think about that in the first 6 months, and now you think about the slow deaths by starvation that are happening, it makes you very angry and agitated. And how much longer can we wait? I think that's a fair question of the government of Tigray, but it's also, they make the call of sending all these people out to war again. It's not an easy one. So, I won't say that they're holding back TDF. I can't say that that's a reality, but I do think though we're at a point now where, it's you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. You have to, a decision has to be called at this point. And frankly, it was called by Ethiopia. The government, the Prosperity Party has restarted and broke the truce. So at this point, it's not even a choice. The people are forced to go back out to fight. So and TDF really just means the people of Tigray. It's the innocent farmer and the teacher and the nurse and the actor and the journalist who are going out to fight. It's not necessarily a well-trained militia, but it's a fight for survival. So it's a tough one. It's really tough.
Well, what can I say? My condolences to you, Millete. Is the grief is immense, and I can't even begin to imagine how tough it would have been to you. And I wouldn't want to remind you of that extremely horrific memory, but I think it's important also to talk about how you managed to carry on, not just functioning but being extremely this fearless fighter for Tigray, never held back, and you continue to inspire people, continue to do wonderful things, journalism, activism, community organizing. We'll come back to that later. How did you manage to do all that and still carrying that immense grief, Millete?
Well, first of all, don't deify me because I'm a normal person. I don't think I've done anything that the average Tigrayan has done, and I think it's dangerous when we glorify someone. And
well, I think, but it's sorry to interject, but I think our listeners could judge for themselves. So they don't need me to say that to know what you have been doing. But I think that's beside the point now. Yeah.
Yeah. So, for me, the more I'll tell you what drives me. What drives me is I am very close to my elders. So my story is I was born in Sudan in a refugee camp because the genocide was occurring then as well. In the 80s. Came here very young. I grew up in the United States. I've been here since I was an infant. So my father was a freedom fighter. He fought physically. He also went to Sudan and continued the struggle from there, and then ultimately got an opportunity to come to the United States, and he did. And so we've been here ever since. But once we were able to go back home, back to Ethiopia, we went. The first time I went, I think I was 18 years old, and I've gone back literally every year ever since. So I have a really strong relationship with the elders. So by the elders, I mean, I only knew one grandparent, the rest had perished, but my grandmother, who I'm very, very close to, I haven't talked to her. I haven't talked to her in almost 2 years now. And that's devastating to me. And she had, just before the war started, had an awful fall and was having memory issues. And so we were talking every day because it helped her, kind of remember things. And then just cold turkey, I can't talk to her anymore because of the way the power was disconnected. So there's her. There's my aunt on my dad's side, she's an elderly aunt. My dad was much older than my mom. So all of his aunts all his sisters are like grandmothers to me. I haven't talked to her in all of this time. So that's what drives me, a desire to be able to reconnect with my elders and hoping that they're still alive and knowing the urgency of people can't survive without food. And so if I'm not able to help break the siege and do my part, I may never return to them. My biggest fear is going back to Tigray, an entire generation of elders are gone. That is my biggest fear. And how do you have a society with no elders? And so it even makes me emotional now because just imagine that. Stories that we haven't captured. We've done a terrible story of understanding and capturing the stories of our elders. And so that's what drives me every day. And so, yeah, that comes at a sacrifice. I have young children here, but I have a very understanding partner. I have an amazing mother who helps me as well. A really strong Tagaro community in Colorado and in Denver. And so there's a decent support system there. And that's what drives me and will continue to drive me until there's some kind of resolution, until we're able to reach our families and know they're okay and be able to support them. There is no way to stop until we get to that point. And so at this point, I see all Tigrayans as my family, to be honest. So when I am able to, you hear about these cash smugglers. When I send money, I don't just send for my family. I ask them, please, on your way, distribute, and I send an equal amount to people you don't know, just people who you see. Same thing in Sudan in the refugee camps. I don't just send from, I have a relative there who I found when I went back with Tigray Media House. So when I send money, I don't just send for my family. At this point, we're all family. At this point, it's survival. So I hope that answers your question, but that's what drives me. And it comes at financial sacrifice. I own several businesses, but I've really neglected a lot of that because this is a priority for me. My children, I'm not spending the kind of time I want to spend with them because I'm doing things that I hope are going to help liberate Tigray. So, and I'm no different than so many other Tigrayans who are doing the same thing. They just maybe don't have the platform to talk about what they're doing, or they're not as visible. So, and it's our duty. We don't have a choice at this point. In the same way, these young people who had all of these dreams are going out into a battlefield. It's no different. I mean, our battle looks different, but there's no choice in that.
Thank you for being generous with your personal story, Millete. That was powerful, and I'm sure it's going to be inspirational to our listeners. And I have to say credit to your mother, to your partner, and to your children as well. And I'm sure your father would be so proud, and I mean that sincerely, Millete. But I think by way of consolation, the only thing I would say that we are in this together, and I think the story that you just recounted, your personal story, I think other people would have more or less the same story, thousands of other Tigrayans. So we are in this together, and I hope Tigray would soon be liberated, and there will be moments to celebrate and to be joyful and to start reliving our lives. We have been deprived of our lives. That's what happened. I think Tigrayan lives have become, they have come to a standstill. I think that's what happened for the past 2 years. But anyways, I don't want to be too sentimental. I think we should quickly go to our next issue. I think the next one that I would want us to talk about, Millete, is related to our stories, but I think in the light of the issue that we raised before in terms of the pieces in the chessboard moving now, and new alliances being formed, and the main actors in the international community kind of siding with Abiy. Maybe that could, what happened yesterday and today could be a blip. It could change. They could come to their senses. So maybe I shouldn't get ahead of myself in terms of making conclusions. But at any rate, I think we have to also make readjustments at Tigrayan community in terms of how we go about doing advocacy and activism, and also journalism. And you mentioned Lucy as well, and the way she has been composing herself. I have taken a lot of exception with the way she has been doing things. So maybe we'll briefly mention that. But broadly speaking, what do you think that we should do now as a community in terms of advocacy, in terms of coming together as a community, being a family? I think you raised a very, very important point in terms of us now having become one unit, very, close-knit family, and that's really beautiful to witness. But just give me some ideas of what you think should happen now, in terms of our advocacy. I think that's useful.
Absolutely. I think that the advocacy groups have actually done an incredible job up until this point, especially because we are pretty much drinking from a fire hose. If you think about what has happened and how we've had to come together and organize and figure out what is effective, what is not effective, a community with limited funds and still being able to have the impact and limited number of people and still having the impact that we've been able to have, I think is nothing short of heroic. So I give a lot of credit to the organized activism, the unorganized activism, to all of it. I think it's amazing. I do think it's time for us to get smart, though. We have to get smart. And by get smart, I mean, people really only care about themselves. So in order to get other people to care about Tigrayans, we have to make it matter for them. And so I think about where we've had success. I think we've had a lot of success in getting people in the Jewish community to care about what's happening in Tigray. And why? Because they relate to genocide and they relate to this, to that whole, and it's so easy to prove what's happening. I mean, it's textbook genocide. This is not, we don't even have to reach. I mean, it's just so obvious, everything, all stages. And so I think we've had a lot of success in getting Jewish organizations and individuals to act and share their platforms and write legislators for us and connect us with legislators. I know personally I've had a lot of success in that. So I think that is a story of success in activism. I think there have been other areas where we have not had as much success. I think about the fact that we don't have a face for our story. A faceless story is never going to stick. You know, when I talk to people about what's happening in Tigray and I say 7 million people don't have access to clean water, don't have access to food, don't have electricity, don't have access to banking, people don't get it. They're just kind of like, they glaze over. But when I say I haven't talked to my grandmother in 2 years, people are outraged. I mean, just completely outraged. And so in a way it's absurd, but it's also very telling. And so we have to put a face to our collective story. We kind of started to do that with Mona Lisa and the atrocious things that were happening when most of Tigray was still occupied, and frankly, it's still happening in Western Tigray. And so there was traction there, thanks to CNN's Nima El-Bashir. Thanks to her, we got those stories, and we also were able to put a face to the story. And so the problem was more things kept happening, and as a activist, you know, the activist community was trying to figure out how to bring those other issues to light instead of just carrying forward the one that had traction. And so we lost traction with that story. And so, Teklai, I'm convinced our biggest issue is that we don't have a face to our story. We have to, and I don't know, what do you pick? How do you decide what that is? Or is that an organic thing? Or is that, I mean, how do you do that? But if you think about the 80s, what really helped us get out of that, what we thought was a famine, but, you know, was actually man-made then as well. What changed that narrative were the journalists who took images of skeleton-thin children, you know, and there's the one famous image that people try and account to other starvation stories in the Horn of Africa, but was actually our story of the child who was being eaten by a bird, was being pecked by, or the bird was like approaching him, actually, him or her, as they were trying to get to a feeding center. And so that is what actually changed, what got the world to act. But we don't have an image. We don't have something people can picture and want to stop. And so our stories, and I'm guilty too of you know, millions of people, even saying 500,000 people, it's not resonating for people. And so somehow as organizers, as activists, we've got to figure out what is our story? Like, how are we going to tell this in a way that sticks? So there were the images of trigger warning, but the people being burned alive, the Tigrayans being burned alive. I remember the moment we showed that to a legislator, and the next day he was tweeting, talking, writing letters, asking, you know, like making a whole stink, obvious, as he should, about the atrocities that are happening in Tigray. So those things work. They push people to action, and we see them as tagaru. Someone described it as trauma porn. We share that among ourselves, and it makes us act, right? It motivates us to, geez, why are they doing this kind of thing? You know, and those images are etched in your brain and make you keep going. But we've got to figure out how we get that to the greater world to get them to respond as well. I mean, you and I offline talked about, you know, like Black Lives Matter. Why didn't they pick this up? Why do they not see this as their story? And I still think it's not foregone. I think we still can work on that. But our issue too is defining things. We allowed the Ethiopian government to come up with this story about neo-colonialism and neo-imperialism and Pan-Africanism. It was the most bizarre thing, the way that that all got twisted. But BLM is about state violence. It's a movement against state violence on Black bodies. That's exactly what's happening in Tigray. That is the story that we don't tell well. And so it's really challenging, but I think our activism just needs to be more pointed in those, in terms of all of us, everything reaching a pinnacle story or moment. And I don't even have an answer to what that is, but I know that we're missing that. We're missing the face to our story.
Yeah, well, interesting. From time to time, some broadcasters approach me to send them messages about what is happening, right? And so Al Jazeera, BBC, and things like that. And something that I noticed, if I sent them a well-crafted argument about what is happening, right, there's a chance that they drop it. But if I send them personal story about how I haven't been able to speak to my mother and stuff, immediately there's guarantee that they're going to air it. So it's very important to give our stories some sort of personal touch. So that's a powerful point. But I think you went into considerable detail about the things that we have been doing right, and of course we have to continue doing them that way. But I think the other point you raised in terms of giving our story narrative in the face, I think that's also very important. And that could actually be because we failed on the whole to do that. That could be the reason why the global movement like BLM didn't really pick our story, right? Even though it should have been a quintessential Black Lives story, really. But I think the other point that I would point, Millete, and you will expand on it, is I think our advocacy has been based on the premise that if we garnered sympathy from the international community, that would push them to act. But I think we have learned the hard way that sympathy doesn't really, it's not really something that could be acted upon. And I was just wondering if maybe we have failed as a community to become, for instance, the grants in the US are not a force, a political force to be reckoned with, so that, a senator kind of realizes that if he doesn't listen to what they are saying, they pay a price personally in their political career. So maybe we haven't really become a political force as a community. What's your sense of that?
I think that's a great point. First of all, I think you're right. Sympathy does not necessarily get people to act. They need to know that there is a detriment to them not acting. And so we have to figure out what is the cost of inaction for them, not for us. We keep talking about it like we are losing our families, but they're not losing their families. So that's not necessarily going to work. It will work for some, but generally it's not going to work. So we need to figure out what is the cost of inaction to these people, to the senator, to the whoever it is. So I think that's a great point. As far as political force, what's interesting to me is, and I can speak about us in Colorado and what we've been able to do, in that there are a lot of Tigrayans here who have been politically involved, be it in activism and Black Lives Matter and that kind of thing, or even just in general in supporting various politicians, who are in office, who have been elected, or who have failed because we advocated against them and were on the ground and knocking doors and doing all of that. So I think we've done a decent job of being politically involved even before we needed help. And so that has gone a long way in getting us an ear to these various leaders in Colorado. So that's one thing, is we're late. We need to be politically active early on. The other thing is, as a community, we all considered ourselves Ethiopian. So there was no strong organizing among Tagaru. And so what does that mean? When people see these new or old legislators see statements from the quote unquote Ethiopian community, which we once considered ourselves a part of, they're taking that more strongly than a statement coming from a Tigrayan whatever organization. So we still have this uphill battle of educating, what's happening and making it so that it actually matters to legislators here, because they don't, if it doesn't relate, they'll just say, well, that's something that's happening in East Africa. What are we supposed to do about that? You know what I mean? So, but there are things like we failed even on simple things. We still don't have temporary protective status for Tigrayans. They have that for Ukraine. I mean, it's the most basic. And by the way, every instance that I've been involved with a refugee who's trying to get political asylum here because of what's happening, Tigrayans, the judge has voted in their favor. So it's not because there's no belief but for some reason we can't convince the United States government to give us temporary protective status. It's very bizarre that we fail even on the most easiest thing. But again, I think it's because we're drinking from a fire hose. So much is coming out and we're trying to capture it all instead of like focusing on what's, on one thing. And as a result, you drop all the balls. You don't, we need to try and just catch one. And be more focused in that way. So there are some really good people out there who are doing the work, though, like Samuel Gabru. I know you know you probably know who he is.
Yeah, I do.
He's genius. Like he's so smart around all of these things, and his framing is so smart. And there are lots of other people like him in different organizations that are now working together and doing this advocacy together. There's a young man named Izana with Omna, who's also really smart, and he's working hard on these temporary protective status things. So we're there. We're working on it. It's just, we need some direction. We need to be more focused, to show our power. But it's not, we did a pretty powerful, and I don't want to like put all these cards on the table, but we've had a lot of high level meetings with people who, legislators and policymakers in the United States, I think, and it's made a difference in terms of where we are. We're still not where we need to be. There's important bills that we're trying to get passed here that I think do stand a chance. But, we were just thrown into this too, very much just thrown into this. Those of us who have been there for a while are having a little bit more success than those who are just now starting. Difficult.
I mean, we were caught off guard, and it's been learning by doing for all of us, I think. I think we're about to run out of time, Millete, but to just kind of wrap up our chat by lighter conversation. Why don't you tell me about the non-political community activity that you have been doing in Denver, I believe. I think they are very important, especially, we have been having some problems in our community with people going into depression, and there has been actually even more sad stories. And I know that you have been taking very active role in bringing the community together and doing, activities like I think boot camping. You have that, and also modeling and things like that. So tell me about those things and the kind of the essence of doing that, and we will finish with that.
Yeah, thank you for asking. I think that's actually could be a whole conversation of its own someday. But part of my self-care was to sort of turn back toward local community and not spend all of my time on on what's happening across the ocean, something that I have very little control over. That was literally, I think, driving me crazy and is driving a number of people crazy. And so I had to turn back and say, okay, what can I do locally that will have an impact, that helping Tagaru here locally also helps Tagaru back home, right? If we're strong here, we're able to do more to help our families. So I was elected earlier this year president of the Tigray community of Colorado, which sounds great, but is actually a lot of work. It's a volunteer position, obviously. There's a lot of need in our community here. We probably have one of the largest Tigrayan communities in the diaspora. So I would venture to say we are, of the 50 to 60,000 Ethiopians in Colorado, we are probably half of that population. So we just didn't know because we blended. So once all of this has come to light, whether you liked it or not, you were identified as a Tigrayan. And I'm proud of that, but there are some people who enjoyed being able to pass, and now they can no longer pass. So anyway, it brought our community together, but it also identified a lot of holes. So we have a lot of our elders who are struggling because they sit and watch devastating news all day on YouTube, and and despair of not knowing how that impacted your particular family. So a lot of depression has come out of that, to the point where there are some elders who are saying, I need help. I really need help. I need to talk to someone, which is unique for our community, I think. I don't know that the idea of like therapy is something that we necessarily, I think we did it differently and organically, maybe in like when we're doing coffee ceremonies or whatever, sort of our therapy as well. But needing like asking for specific, professionals to help you. Among our young people, we're seeing, drug abuse, we're seeing suicide, we're seeing a lot of things, and it's not unique to us, but we have a bigger population, so we're able to see it faster maybe than other places and identify it and try to come up with a solution. So all of that being said, it's been, I don't know, 6 months or so since I came in as president, and we have roughly almost the entire board is new. So we've been doing a number of things, one of which is Camp Tigray, like you pointed out. Tigrayans were forced to come to like a reckoning about our identity and who we are as people. And so that was very frustrating and hard and difficult for even myself. I always knew I was from Tigray, but I identified as an Ethiopian, whatever that is. Now I don't even know what that is anymore. It's a very, very interesting conversation, but I'm very clear on what a Tigrayan is now. And so I think a lot of people are still dealing with that. A lot of our young people are dealing with that, especially those who are not entrenched in the conversations every day like you and I are. And their friends point this out to them at school because of what they hear at home. Their non-Tigrayan friends. Oh, you're a Tigrayan? that kind of thing. So we decided to, and this is the second year that the camp has happened, but essentially we take this year 50 young people into the mountains, and it's a 2-night retreat basically. And it's basically a camp where we talk about identity, we talk about history, but not in a mundane way. We talk about it like and relate it to what's happening now. We answer questions, we talk about mental health, we sit around a campfire, like we hike, we do all of those things. So it's very fun. We dance, we allow the young people to cook, and I mean, it's just a lot of fun, but it's also heavy conversation. And it's crazy. Young people are far more honest than any other age group about what's happening, what their questions are, what their concerns are, what their, what information is not, that they're lacking. So it was a very deep weekend retreat. So that's been really wonderful. And then we do other things. We do Tigrinya classes where it's language conversational, but also written. And so our classes are, when I tell you, filled to the brim, like we don't know where to put kids anymore. That's how packed our classes are. And we're thinking of breaking up classes, and like, the response has been huge. There's a hunger to really understand who we are as Tagaru. And I think that's the silver lining of all of this awful stuff that is happening in Tigray is, I think for Tigray itself, at the end of the day, will be a good thing. The sacrifice is big. The death and destruction is huge. I wouldn't do it again if they said, would you? However, that silver lining is that people want to know who they are as Tigrayans. And there's a pride and beauty behind that understanding. And it makes our young people stronger to know who they are. It helps them be healthier, make better choices. It gives them a sense of purpose. And it's like a tree with no roots. It's going to die. Yeah. And so we're fighting to make sure that our young people understand where they come from and what that means so that they can lead healthy lives wherever they are. And ultimately, I believe that will circle back and help Tigray in the long run. So those are some of the things. We're doing things like Ashenda and making it a really big deal, especially because of how this war has impacted women and girls. But so we're like really overdoing Ashenda this year. Our celebration is going to be on September 4th in Denver. So those are the kinds of things that we're doing to try and uplift our community locally.
Yeah, well, first, congratulations on your presidency, Millete. I'm sure you're going to do incredible things. And I think it's very important that people realize the social events are actually very important. It could be tempting in the light of what is happening, the horror that is unfolding in Tigray, to think that social events are trivial, but actually they are not. If it wasn't for the war that we have been trapped into, those will be the things that we would be doing normally. That is life, and that's how you create identity of a community. And if we are going to become kind of successful community as Tigrayans, we're going to have to develop some sort of distinct culture, some vitality. And I think we'll talk about this another time. And your create and develop those vitalities by having social events at the community, by talking, by developing a culture. It could be academic culture, it could be other cultures. So that's very, very important. But you would know, you wouldn't need me to remind you of that. So thank you so much, Millete. This has been really, really enjoyable for me, and I'm sure our listeners are going to love it. I hope we're going to have many more of these conversations. I'm sure about that. But for today, thank you so much, Millete.
Thank you, Tigray. It's a pleasure. Thank you for sharing your platform and all that you do. I'm a big fan, so thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Millete.